This is The Extra Mile.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Extra Mile. I'm Caleb Spear along with
G5.
the G5.
That's right. And today we are looking or continuing our series on who is God, trying to better understand who is the God that we worship and serve and love. If you're following us on anywhere on podcasts or YouTube, you can find that those episodes, just look for who is God, colon mark, and then there's an attribute. But our first one, if you're looking for it, was on Yahweh, was on him, was introducing who he is and his name, I am, which is God is. Our last episode that we did last month was on God's wrath and justice, really focusing on justice there. And today we are looking at who is God? Love. Love. 1 John 4:8. God is love.
That's kind of, we're going to see it's the coin of God's justice.
Yeah. Yep.
They go hand in hand. All right, let's not delay any further. Let's just hop on into the Bible. We've referenced the Shema. That's Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5, right in there, with the Jewish people would pray 3 times a day traditionally.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Probably what Daniel's praying. He prays 3 times a day.
Oh, probably the Shema.
Maybe, but Shema means listen. That's the first word there in verse 4. Hear. In their minds, that's like you better do. We were talking about this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. That's Yahweh. Yahweh is one. We talked about that with the triune nature of God.
Yeah, the Trinity, yep.
But you shall love. Let's focus on that word. It's a commandment for us. God is love, and yet God's people are commanded to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. That word love is Hebrew, and that is the word ahava.
Ahava. Does that mean I ahava my laptop? Ahava this
so
McGriddle.
Like most languages, honestly, come on, English language. Like most languages, Hebrew has many words for love. Some that are specific for romantic or more friendship, companionship. This word's kind of generic, kind of like our English word for love. Not all of you like it. Shame on you. But I love eggnog.
Oh yeah, eggnog's the best.
All right, eggnog
the best.
lovers.
We're good. Yeah.
I can't believe some of you don't like eggnog. That's a shame. God's good creation.
Come on. Dairy, the greatest thing ever.
Dairy. Jeez, eggnog's so good. But I don't just say I love eggnog. I say I love my mom, right? Those have two very, hopefully, different.
Are you putting those on the same level?
I don't know. Eggnog might get offended.
Did you hear that, Caleb's mom?
Yeah, my mom would be offended if I was like, I love you as much as I love a glass of eggnog. Obviously, in our context, they have different meanings.
Right.
Right, George?
Right.
What else do you love, George?
I love my girls, my daughters, and
I was fully waiting for you to say I love coffee. I'm shocked you didn't say coffee.
Well, I have
You're
priorities.
Yes, you're a good father.
I do. I love coffee. I mean, that's probably number 5.
Number 5 is coffee. But Hebrew, ahava, generic for love. Isaac uses it kind of like we've been using it when he's old and he's giving away his blessings and he can't see, when he's getting duped by his lying son with his fake Esau. He says, prepare for me a delicious food such as I ahava. So he uses the word for loving food. What's Genesis 29:18 use the word?
Romantic ahava. This is Jacob loved Rachel, ahava, Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel.
That's a lot of ahava. It's a lot of love to say, I'm going to work.
Well, I hope so, because it was 14 years.
Yeah, you got duped. I'm realizing
everyone getting duped.
Yeah, Genesis, a lot of liars.
Who do you really ahava? That's the question, because if it's not God, you're going to get duped.
The end. 1 Samuel 18:1. Here's our brotherly love, or man crush, if you will.
All right.
David has finished talking to Saul, and as soon as he finishes, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul.
That's right. I'm not sure if it's the same level for you.
I have a man crush on George. Okay, and then, of course, you can have corporate ahava. The people, all Israel and Judah, loved David. Why? He was defeating the Philistines. I love that guy.
There's appreciation there. That guy's awesome.
Taking out the giants.
Yeah. He's doing it. That's what everyone...
But this is the same word for Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall ahava Yahweh your Elohim, the Lord your God. But is that just is God, is Yahweh some random deity who just shows up and holds people at gunpoint?
Love me.
Right now. That's how a lot of atheists really try and paint the God of the Bible.
Yeah, he's a selfish God that just wants your attention.
But what would you say to that, George?
Well, I think back at Abraham, even when he calls Abraham
Oh, yeah, Genesis 12,
to
yeah.
go. Yeah, he's done so much for us. He's given us every reason to love him, and Abraham has faith in him and enough love to do what he's telling him to do.
Yeah, the story of Genesis 1 through 11 repeats. There's just Adam and Eve, and it's like, we're done. And then it gets down to one godly family, flood, wipe them out, we're done. And then Genesis 11, they're still being evil, and God spreads them out and gives them different languages at the Tower of Babel. And now it's back to one godly family. And God's like, watch this, I'm going to keep working here. And he picks Abraham. But think of the promises he gave Abraham.
Yeah, he's going to keep working. That's good, yeah, with those promises.
Because it's that family of Abraham that ends up in slavery in Egypt. We've replayed that story a lot in this series because it has to do with God's character. You see it because it's not just a feeling. We'll talk about that in a sec, but God's action.
All the way down to his law. Yeah, he proves his love for his people.
Yeah, Deuteronomy chapter 7, like in verse 6, he says, you, talking to the Israelites, you're a people holy to Yahweh your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession. And he mentions in verse 7, it's not because you did anything. It's not because you were more numerous than the others. You know, it's as New Testament language, it's not works-based. He says, but it's because Yahweh ahavas you. He loves you, and he's keeping the oath he swore to your fathers, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. That's why Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, right? Pharaoh.
So God has love for Israel here.
Yes.
Ahava.
And it goes with his faithfulness, if you will. He's consistent. There's the word. The promises he keeps, he's consistent, and he loves them because that's his character.
That's the other side of the love coin, I guess, faithfulness.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that's exactly Jeremiah 31:3.
Jeremiah 31:3 says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you.
Yeah, it's tied in, again, because God is all these things.
Yeah, in October, we looked at faithfulness, if you're wondering.
Yeah, you can check that out if you haven't yet. But it's everlasting love. That's eternal love. There's no beginning or end when I use this word everlasting. It's because God is. That's a really cool thought. God's love is eternal because he himself is eternal.
It continues going. Yeah.
Same thing for his justice, right? He's consistent. But Israel is often portrayed as God's wife in the Old Testament, kind of like how the bride of Christ is the church
in the New Testament. Yeah.
What's Jeremiah 2:2 say?
I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness in a land not sown.
Yeah, so there's the Exodus story. But then in Jeremiah 3:1 it says, you've played the whore with many lovers, talking about the false gods. Would you return to me, declares Yahweh?
That's the opposite of what God has done for us. He's proven our love. Our love for him. But, you know, the people here, Israelites here, have done the opposite.
Right. They've played the harlotry.
Right.
And so this shows us, hopefully we'll talk about this also with the parent-child relationship as well, but here it is with a spousal relationship.
Right.
It's also a feeling for God. When people, again, atheists paint jealous as if it's wrong. No, if something belongs to you and you belong to them, Israel's supposed to belong to God. God's their God. God's righteously jealous.
A deep desire and belonging.
When they break his law, when they commit idolatry. The same we would be jealous for our spouse if there was unfaithfulness there. It's righteous. So God feels pain when we're unfaithful because he loves us.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not just a feeling because like choosing Abraham, like you mentioned, like the Exodus, and like we'll talk about it with the cross, God shows it in action, right? It's a verb.
There we have to follow it up with action.
And that's why God's people are to imitate him. Like the Deuteronomy 6:5, we're commanded to love the Lord. It stems from the reality that God loved Israel first. That was the whole idea. If you were going to be God's people, you're going to imitate God.
Sure.
Both in justice, like they had in the law.
So if you hear, you're going to do. But if you love, you're going to love others.
Yeah.
It just kind of follows that train of...
Yeah, the Hebrew thought, Shema, when you hear and listen, it's expected you do. Yeah.
You got that, kids?
Yes.
Do it. Yeah.
That's probably why the book of James, the New Testament book, goes into great length to say, don't be a hearer only.
So if you love, you're going to love as well.
Right.
Follow it up with action.
Yeah, and here's some action in the old law. What's Leviticus? Leviticus 19:18 says what?
You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. That sounds very familiar.
Yes, we're going to talk about how Jesus references these. But that's why in Deuteronomy 10:17 through 19, it talks about how Yahweh is a God of gods. He's mighty. He's awesome. He's not partial. He executes justice in verse 18 for the fatherless and the widow. Because he ahavaz, right? He loves the sojourner, giving them food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So God's saying you should love what I love. I love helping the neediest of people. I love them. They're also image bearers. You too should love the neediest of people. As a matter of fact, you were the neediest of people when your nation was enslaved to Pharaoh. You weren't getting out of there.
And I delivered you. Yeah.
The same ought to be said for us. We can't deliver ourselves from our sin today. I mean, we need the Lord.
Yeah, we need Jesus. Yeah.
We need our own Exodus, so to say. That's a picture here. And this is why the New Testament has the same consistent moral teaching about loving God and loving others. What's 1 John 4:19 say?
Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love.
That's 1 John 4:8, but that's the connection.
Oopsies.
You're fine. That's the connection there. Of if we don't love, we don't know God.
Oh, that's right. 1 John 4:19 is if we love because he first loved us.
Right. For the Israelites, it was choosing Abraham. It was Exodus. For us, obviously, we look to the cross of Christ. If we don't love, that's kind of scary. You don't know God. You could be a great theologian, genius. And if you don't love, actually, ironically, you don't know him. You don't know God. And this is the Greek word, usually agape or agapeo. Kind of cousin words you can tell there, but they're all over the New Testament.
Yeah.
And it too is going to be used kind of like ahava, where it can be used in different ways, but especially when it comes to, action, it gets involved with that all the time.
I mean, this kind of harpers, before we move on too fast, the idea that, I want to teach my own kids to love and to show love so that they can practice that own principle and continue to love others as well. If I'm not very loving, I'm not saying they're not going to love others as well, but they're going to have a hard time seeing love if it's the first thing they see isn't love.
Yeah, if God was not a loving God, I think people would be wanting to follow him.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And Jesus, of course, is the one who demonstrates that perfectly, both as man and as God. What does Jesus say in Matthew 22, verses 35 through 40?
And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love, agapeo, the Lord your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love, agapeo, your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets.
Yeah, that's why in other places where Jesus has the golden rule, do unto others as you'd want them to do unto you.
So he's combining, though, this Deuteronomy, Leviticus.
Yeah, he's combining Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor, and he's combining the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, of love the Lord your God, all your heart, soul, and mind. And he's saying, yeah, these two go together hand in hand. If you love God, you love your neighbor. That's what he's saying. And don't make the mistake, we're not actually loving our neighbor if we're allowing them to fester in a life apart from God and sin. That's not loving them, because the greatest love we can share with someone is to unite people with God, or to bring them, God to
Right.
But it should go hand in hand. We express our love for God when we love our neighbor. Whether it's at church, giving someone a warm greeting, a phone call, doing something in the community, like the children's home here in Lubbock, or going and helping the homeless. All that needs to be tied in with giving glory to God, with sharing the gospel if they're lost.
Otherwise, it's not for me. It's because of what God did.
Yeah, it becomes a huge problem if our good works don't glorify our Father in heaven. But I think worship, though, is a great example of loving God and loving others. There's only one passage I could really think of that outright commands assembling, which may be shocking to some of you. It's not a lot talked about, honestly. And it first goes the negative, then to a positive, but it tells us why we assemble as Christians. You want to read Hebrews 10, 24 and 25?
Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for who promised is faithful. And let us consider who to stir up one another how to stir up, one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. But here's a positive, I guess you're saying, right? But encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.
Yeah, and you might be thinking, well, I thought worship was
For God.
to worship God. We're not worshiping each other. No, of course not. That would be wrong. We're not doing that. But when we worship God, we are encouraging each other. You hear a good sermon, prayer, maybe something about the table. I don't know about you, when I'm listening to other people sing, that's encouraging to me when I hear people sing.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
Yeah. It uplifts us. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if we are loving to God, if we're worshiping Him, we're automatically encouraging and lifting up and edifying as you hear other people.
If we tried separating those two when we went to church, so to say, I just get in there, ignore everyone else, sit down, do
Worship
my thing,
God,
worship, take my bread, take my communion, and be like, call it a day. That's not how church works. That's not how it's supposed to work, actually, because God says, no, these things go hand in hand.
But one is basically an effect of the other. I mean, if I'm worshiping God, I'm going to encourage others.
That's really good. Because this love is not in action, it's not self-seeking.
Right.
I mean, Jesus said in Luke 6:35, but love your enemies. Your enemies? Now we're not talking about church people. I'm talking about enemies. That doesn't sound easy. Do good. Lend, expecting nothing in return. There it goes back to the idea of helping perhaps the neediest of people. Or if they're your enemy, they may not want to give you something in return. That goes back to what we were just talking about, Matthew 5:16. We do good works that glorify our Father in heaven. Which is why you were saying, George, if we don't tell people about Jesus, and if God's not getting the glory in our good deeds,
What's the point of the good works?
Yeah, you're promoting yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the point of loving if there isn't a God that loves us?
You're kind of putting the spotlight on me instead of, to Jesus.
Right.
Big
And so
mistake.
the whole point is to connect them to an eternal love.
Yeah. And doing such good deeds, loving our enemies, doing good to those who can't repay us, is actually part of our spiritual worship. A lot of people think our spiritual worship is just like when you're in the church building on Sunday. That would be biblically inaccurate, because what does Romans 12:1 say?
I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship.
Yeah, so I picture my body as a living sacrifice. This is my whole life, right? This is everything. I think sometimes we make the mistake where we try to separate physical and spiritual to our own demise sometimes. I think we want to separate secular and spiritual. Because even when I'm at the church building, it's a physical place. If I'm standing preaching in the pulpit, it's a physical pulpit. When I'm singing, I'm physically producing air and the vocal noise to sing. But yet it's spiritual.
Yeah.
The same thing with my living bodies. My whole life is spiritual worship to God. I think the Pharisees ended up doing this too. If we end up separating the physical and the spiritual to this hierarchy, like we were talking about this, like with Corbin, in Mark 7, where they're like, oh, what's more spiritual than giving your money to the temple, to Yahweh? And Jesus was like, you're actually breaking the commandments of God, because it says to honor your father and mother. It's 10 Commandments 101. So they were neglecting their mom and their dad by giving money to the temple. So by itself, you'd be thinking, oh, there's nothing better than giving money to your synagogue or to your temple and your church. And God says, well, actually, no. If you're not honoring your father and your mother, if you're not loving others, but trying to play it at the expense of what I really love God, you're breaking God's commandment. And you're not loving. And that's what's scary, because 1 John 4 said, if you don't love, you don't know God.
And that's not spiritual worship.
That's not spiritual worship.
So it should be all-encompassing.
Yes.
Really. And it should transform us. I think the rest of that verse 2 says it should transform us and transform our lives.
Transform our minds.
Do God's will, what is good and perfect and pure. And those are the things that if we fulfill those things are going to be spiritual worship.
Right. And the name Christian means Christ-like. Paul said, 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate me, not just Paul, but imitate me because I imitate Christ. We're imitating God. Just like the Israelites, God loved the sojourner.
Right.
God loved justice. God loved mercy. He loved all that. The Israelites were supposed to replicate that. And of course, Jesus is the very character of God. He's the perfect human being, God in the flesh. He does all that. Like John 13, when Jesus washes everyone's feet. That's servant love. It's shocking, right?
It is. It's spiritual. I guess you could say Peter, he's all upset, right?
I really relate with Peter, where I'd be like, "What are you doing? You're my rabbi. You're my teacher. You're the Lord. You're
but
the King
he's
of
thinking
Kings."
physically. He's
Yeah.
thinking physically. He's not thinking spiritually. Jesus is thinking spiritually. This is spiritual worship.
But it has a physical manifestation.
Right.
Just the same as the Lord's Supper does, or baptism does.
Right.
And so Jesus is like, no, I'm gonna serve you. Jesus said, like in Luke 19, we came to seek and save the lost. He's reaching out to the outcast. Everyone hated the tax collectors. It's true. It was messed up, a lot of them, what they were doing to people.
Yeah, sure.
But Jesus reached out to them. Prostitutes, is that a sin? Duh. But they were treated as dirt. Jesus loved them and reached out to them. The sick, the lame, the blind, the poor, all these people could all be, I guess, categorized as poor. Well, we ought to see ourselves in that way. I mean, Jesus said in, was it Revelation 2 or 3? Jesus said to the church at Laodicea that said, oh, we don't need anything because they monetarily were rich. They were living the good life. And he said, actually, you're poor. You're pitiable.
You're lukewarm.
Yeah, because you don't have God at the center of your life. So we should. But Jesus emulates that in seeking the outcast, which means we need to do the same.
Right. We need to be imitators.
Yeah. But of course, this ultimate love is kind of the exclamation point you see at the crucifixion of Jesus.
It all ties right there.
Yeah.
That's the perfect symbol, a perfect act of love.
Yes. And I think so there's our action, but also to help us see it even more, there's a feeling, right, too? God's hurt when his people are unfaithful.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the Old Testament with the shadows of the cross could help us today have the feeling to just get a glimpse of what God's feeling was.
A motivating factor here.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Genesis 22.
With Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah.
And
Eric
son.
actually brought that up on the podcast. Was that last week or the week before?
Yeah, that was last week. All right. That was the last episode, yeah.
Oh, it was? Yeah, and Eric was saying how, man, I don't know. If I were told to offer up my own kid, I don't think I could.
And he lost his daughter. Mm-hmm. If you haven't listened, go listen to that. It's a really powerful message.
Yes.
And he said that increased his faith. And Abraham here in this story, if we're going to read it here, is walking by faith.
Yeah, he's right. He's the father of the faithful, so to say. Yeah, I mean, I think about it. Like, he loves his son Isaac. Isaac is a son of promise with the great nation that's a promise.
Yeah.
There's a miraculous birth because they were too old to biologically conceive a child. And so that happened, and they're amazed by that. And yet he's told in Genesis 22:22, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you ahavah, whom you love, go to land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I'll tell you. So that sounds like an impossible command to follow from God.
Yeah. I mean, in today's terms, it's like if your son, was born prematurely and then survived cancer, and now you have to go sacrifice him, and he's your only son. I mean, so many things have happened that were miraculous to get to this point. Now, God, you want me to just sacrifice him?
Yeah, and there's a lesson here because when the law comes around, God says this is forbidden, actually.
And it's a powerful thing because I have $2 of my own. I can't imagine doing that. I mean, that's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's how much does the father love his son?
Probably more than I love my girls.
They're eternal beings, right? We talk about they're eternal, they're God. I don't know, like what kind of fellowship God has with himself, between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and that relationship.
But there's a relationship there.
Yeah, if we'd be silly to say, I love so-and-so more than the Father loves his Son, which ought to show how much God loves us, too.
Right, yeah, he loves us.
But Abraham, like God, in a sense, is willing to give up his son, which is unthinkable. But hopefully that puts the relationship on our own terms of, wow, how much does God love us?
And his love for us is unconditional, just like I love my kids. It's an unconditional love. And they do stuff, and it's hard sometimes when they want, when they do something that they shouldn't, or when I have to go the extra mile and serve them or change a diaper or something like that.
Sometimes it's not always a good feeling
to
change a diaper, I'm sure.
No, it's not. And God loves us unconditionally as well. It's when we put conditions on that love that there becomes a problem.
Yeah, when we sin.
That's right.
Yeah, Abraham goes through with this in Genesis 22:5. He says, "Stay here with the donkey to his servants. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." That's a pretty cool statement. You realize if you look closely there what was just said, and also Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham has this belief that, God's kept his promise. I'm going to offer my son, but God raises the dead. And Abraham's
He can do whatever he wants.
Hey, he's saying, me and my son, we're going to come back to you. That's a lot of faith. And I think about the faith of Jesus when, he's praying in the garden. Not my will, but your will be done. I don't know all exactly what God in the flesh is a strange idea, and we only have so many answers in the Bible. But that's a lot of faith Jesus put into his Father to do his will. And that's another question I actually have here, kind of a side thought. We don't know how old Isaac is, because the word boy can go all over the place. It could mean young adult even.
It could.
I don't know. I do know he's old enough to carry the wood.
Do you think he's old enough though to be what is it called? The age of accountability? Do you think he's old enough for that if God's asking him to?
Are you talking about when
make
God
a sacrifice?
says, I think if you're 19 or is it 20?
13 or something like that?
No, I think it's 19 or younger can go into the land.
Yeah.
It might be 20. I think it's 19. But it's either 19 or 20 younger can go in the promised land. But anyone older.
Do you think he's like old enough to have sin?
I don't know.
And awareness. I don't know.
Well, I just know he's old enough in verse 6 to take the wood.
Carry the wood,
offering,
yeah.
Which
Up
again,
a mountain.
Yeah, it shadows Jesus. Yeah, all of it shadowing Jesus. This promised child, the son of a miraculous birth, of a promise, carrying the wood up to a mountain. And Isaac is smart enough to realize, hey, we don't have the lamb. He asks, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And in Genesis 22:8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. We talked about that in God's sovereignty, about how provide, God sees. That's what that word kind of means. But Abraham says, God will provide.
He believes.
Yep. And he uses the term a lamb. I think that's important for the narrative story as well.
There's another shadow to Jesus.
Yeah, because in Genesis 22, 9 through 12, he's going with it. He's got it up. And that's what I always wondered. Was it a straw? That's what I mean. There's a possibility if Isaac's carrying the wood up the mount, that he willingly go to the altar
and lay down. You tie him up.
Yeah. That's a scary scene to picture. I don't know. Bible's not answering that, but there's a question I think of when he's going up there. But Abraham's going with it. He raises the sword and the knife and everything. And the messenger of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, tells him, Abraham, Abraham. He says, here I am. He says, don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So he's going to do it. And God obviously stops him. That's not God's character.
No,
There's
it's
only
not God's character.
one sacrifice to do that. This also could get into the triune nature of God as well, because this messenger says, I know you fear God, but then he goes on to say, you've withheld your son, your only son, from me. For another time.
That's a side point. Yeah.
But in verse 13, Abraham looks, and caught in the thicket in his horns is a ram. But it's not a lamb, interesting enough.
No, it's a ram, yeah.
Because that's interesting, because God, or Abraham told his son Isaac on their way up to Mount Moriah.
Provide a lamb.
Yeah. But as Abraham went, took the ram, offered it, the ram, up as a burnt offering instead of his son. That's substitution right there. That's what's happened with us. We talked about that with Romans 3, with God's justice.
Right.
And Abraham called the name of that place Mount Moriah. Yahweh will provide. It's said to this day, on the mount of Yahweh it shall be provided. So there's still a day to come when such a sacrifice will happen. And by the way, Mount Moriah is the area of Jerusalem, Mount Zion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is where obviously Jesus is crucified right out the city gates of Jerusalem. So crazy shadows, right?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, but Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. It's a lesson of faith. But thinking about it for us, so how much God loves us. How much does the Father love his son? And that gets into John the Baptist. John the Baptist, I think, ties it in with this story, where he tells his disciples in John 1:29, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's a really cool statement.
That shows you how much he loves us.
Yeah, that is God's love. That's right, John 3:16?
Yeah, John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his one only son.
Yeah, and that's amazing. His only son. That's a high price.
Right. Just like Isaac was
Yeah,
Abraham's only son.
it was. So hopefully that puts not only the action but the feeling behind of the impossible amount of love that God has for his son, and by comparison that to us. And then that ties in with our commandment of loving God and loving others, right? Jesus said what in John 15 right here?
In John 15, verses 12 through 14, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you.
Yeah, it makes me think of the chapter before, John 14:15. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. You're my friends if you do what I command you. His commandment is what? To love one another as Jesus loved us.
That's a big ask.
That's a big ask. A huge ask. Jesus also says that in John's account, where they will know that you're my disciples
By the love
that we have for one another.
Yeah.
He doesn't say by certain doctrines.
Yeah.
Jesus makes clear in other places that what we believe about God and what we do as a church is important.
But not by our differences?
Yeah, Jesus is like, oh, they'll know that you're my disciples. If it says Church of Christ outside the building, they'll know you're my disciples by your a cappella singing. And it's like, no, those may be involved in some good things, but that's not how people are going to know these are followers of Jesus.
Right. By love.
Right. Right. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13:13, the greatest of these is love. And earlier he compared it to pagan worship. If you could know all knowledge and great prophecies and you could be the most talented guy, right? Right. We're talking about you could be the greatest theologian.
But if you don't have love, you have nothing.
Yeah. You're a noisy gong. Bang, 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 bang. Or clanging
And no one wants to be a part of that. That's annoying.
It's like this noisy, worthless worship painting of pagan worship, I think, in that context. But that's like what we look at. Even if I've mastered Hebrew and Greek and I'm the theologian and have the Bible memorized, and if I treat my neighbor like dirt, I don't even know God.
That's why spiritual worship is so important.
But yes, Hebrews 1. Yes, so important. And Jesus is commanding us, love one another as I've loved you. May God forgive us every single time we don't do that. This is the basics. This is 101, and yet it's so hard. And Jesus lived it, right? He said, greater love has no one than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends, which some of us may do.
This world says it's the easiest, it's the greatest thing, is to show love by sacrificing yourself.
But who in this world is going to die for an enemy?
Yeah, see, that's a whole new level of love. Yeah.
Go ahead and read Romans 5:6-10.
For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life.
This is our Exodus story.
Yeah.
This is why we love God. And I like how it's scary. It escalates. While we were weak, Christ died for us. For the ungodly then, not just weak, but ungodly. That's us.
And then sinners.
And then next step further, enemies. If you're enemies to a king, what's the king to his enemies?
Yeah,
kills
executes them.
Yeah,
Done.
You're done. And here the king dies for not just his people. Yes, it's his people, but God dies for his enemies. And it's interesting how this is tied in with our last episode on who God is, God's justice and wrath. Because here it says God shows his love for us in verse 8, that Christ died for us while we're sinners. Yet in verse 9 it says we've been saved from the wrath of God. It's on the same coin. Because God must be just against sin.
This reminds me when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he tells Peter to put his sword back. Those who live by the sword die by the sword.
Oh, yeah.
He's bringing peace to the chaos and showing love, even to those that are going to hurt him.
He's there to die for the people who are there to kill him.
Right.
I mean, he just got his... Peter missed Malchus's head and got that ear. It's amazing how I picture him picking up the ear. I don't know if that's how it works, but he heals it right there, and they still arrest him. It's crazy. But I'm sure Jesus' followers are shocked. Like, this seems like a really good time for the Messiah to fight and take over Israel and restore the kingdom.
Right. This is it. This is the moment.
Shocked.
Instead, he shows love.
Yes, he's dying for his enemies. And that includes his followers. Obviously, Judas is the betrayer there. But they flee. They run from him. And Peter watches from a distance, but he ultimately denies Jesus as he predicted.
That is interesting to think that, yes, he even died for Judas, who was there and betrayed him.
Yep.
And Judas had a choice afterwards to fall back into that eternal love.
Yeah. He was remorseful, not repentant. We've talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter was repentant. But that's a crazy story. And it's not like Jesus is like, well, I got nothing else. There's no way else around this, so I might as well do it. No, Jesus tells us, Peter, I could get out of this pretty easily.
Yeah, because of 10,000 angels.
Yeah, I could call 10,000 angels. He's like, don't you think we could do that? Be no problem. That's the message here. He says, but so the scriptures would be fulfilled. The son's obedient to his father. Maybe that was Isaac even with Abraham. Amazing love and faith all combined right there for his enemies.
That's really
I'm
powerful.
going to let my enemies kill me. All right, so I guess
That leads us right into our application.
what we've been talking about, yeah?
That's right. John 4, 8 through 11.
1 John 4.
1 John 4. That's important.
Yeah.
Verses 8 and 11 says, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God has made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world, so that we might live through him. In this is love. Not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
We don't know God if we do not love one another. That's a
Right.
big statement. And this is it, right? Manifest. God came in the flesh. He sent his Son, right? John 3:16, his only Son. He loved us before we loved him, saving us from propitiation. There's the word for like appeasement of angry or the wrath of God,
Right.
tied in with his love.
Right.
But the conclusion, right, is verse 11. The same for the Israelites with their story with Abraham and the Exodus.
If God so loved, then we should love one another.
Yeah, we had better love one another.
Right.
That's how they'll know we're his disciples. Well,
All
I
right.
think that's a wrap.
That gives you some application. Go the extra mile. Go love. Go so.